This is the Chinese megacity of Shenzhen, a gleaming monument to China's economic miracle.
Have found incidents of child labour and there are accusations.
Inside the Zhengzhou factory, which is dedicated to the final stage of iPhone assembly, some 400 discrete tasks are broken down and carried out by its army of workers.
If you've ever read a Western headline about Shenzhen, you've probably been shown two completely different cities. One is the Shenzhen of suicide nets outside factory dorms, workers assembling iPhones for pennies, and streets lined with knockoff electronics. The sweatshop capital of the world. The BBC showed it. The New York Times wrote about it. For years, that was the Shenzhen much of the world thought it knew. Then came the other version. Drone swarms filling the night sky, autonomous buses on the road, robot waiters, cashierless stores, electric taxis everywhere. Suddenly, Shenzhen wasn't a sweatshop anymore. It was China's Silicon Valley. So which one is real? The factory city or the future? That's what we're going to unpack, not just in this video but across this whole series, because the real Shenzhen is more complicated than either label, and a lot more important. What's happening there doesn't just tell you something about China, it tells you where the modern city itself may be going. Let's start with the part most people get wrong. To be clear, that sweatshop image wasn't invented, it was real. Long hours, harsh conditions, rock-bottom wages. For millions of factory workers in and around Shenzhen, that was normal for years. But over the past decade, things have changed. Labor laws got tighter, wages went up, worker protections improved. The conditions still aren't perfect, not even close, but the distance between the old Shenzhen and the one you see today is huge. And the numbers make that hard to ignore. A factory worker in Shenzhen now earns about $1,064 a month. In Monterrey, Mexico, it's around $750. In Ho Chi Minh City, it's closer to $350. Shenzhen's factory floor is now about 40% more expensive than Mexico's, and roughly 3 times Vietnam's. And that breaks the story we've been told for the last 20 years. If cheap labor is the reason the world manufactures in China, that logic should have collapsed a long time ago. Vietnam is far cheaper. Mexico is closer to the US market and has a free trade deal with it. On paper, both should have replaced Shenzhen by now. And in some ways, rising costs did change everything. After 2010, labor and rent kept climbing. Low-end factories, garment workshops, toy assembly lines, basic hardware, simple electronics started to disappear. One by one, they left. Some moved to Vietnam, some to India, some just went inland, where costs were lower. The Shenzhen that once pumped out cheap knockoffs for the world, most of that is gone. But what replaced it is something completely different. Today, Shenzhen is home to 5 of China's top advanced manufacturing clusters. BYD runs giant EV factories here. Foxconn operates lighthouse factories, so automated they can run with almost no lights on. DJI builds the drones that dominate the global consumer market. Apple's supply chain still runs through the Pearl River Delta. Huawei's R&D headquarters is here too. This is no longer a city of low-end manufacturing. It's a city of super factories. And yet the manufacturing never really left, not even close. Hundreds of billions of dollars still flow through a city that is, by almost every measure, no longer the cheap option. So something else is going on. Something a wage spreadsheet can't explain. And understanding that, that's where this story really begins. To understand why Shenzhen's model is so hard to copy, you have to start in one place, Huaqiangbei. In the hardware startup world, people call it Hardware Silicon Valley. You probably imagine clean labs, startup offices, maybe a futuristic tech campus. No, it actually looks like this. It's a neighborhood in central Shenzhen, only about 10 city blocks across. From the outside, it looks like an ordinary cluster of shopping malls, but the moment you step inside, it feels like you've walked into the nervous system of the global electronics industry. Every floor, every hallway, every tiny stall, they're all selling components, not finished products, the guts of products. Chips, capacitors, sensors, connectors, flex cables, LED modules, camera lenses, microphones, batteries, more than 50,000 types of electronic components available off the shelf right here. Thousands of vendors stacked on top of each other, in building after building after building. Whether you're sourcing at industrial scale or just buying a single part yourself, Huaqiangbei can handle both. For anyone who cares about electronics, this place is overwhelming in the best way. Cracked your phone screen? A few bucks. 10 minutes. Done. Phone cases for 50 cents. Screen protectors for 15. Watch bands, earbuds, trendy collectibles. And beyond all of that, high-tech drones and AI-powered robots. But this is where Huaqiangbei stops being just a market and starts becoming something much more important. And lately, a new trend has emerged here. Visitors from around the world are dragging empty suitcases into Huaqiangbei, not because they're moving in, but because they plan to fill them with electronics before they leave. For a lot of buyers, the prices are simply too cheap to pass up.
I bought a microphone because I love vlogging.
I went 2 days to Huaqiangbei.
I've been in Huaqiangbei.
For hardware startups, this changes the game. In San Francisco, you come up with an idea for a hardware product, and then the waiting begins. Emails to suppliers, sample requests, negotiations across time zones. You can spend weeks just trying to get the right components. Sometimes it takes months before you even hold a prototype in your hands. Here, component sourcing can happen in 2 hours, a working prototype in 3, mass production in 1 to 3 days. That's not a small improvement. It's a completely different speed. Hardware founders from Silicon Valley and Berlin don't come here as tourists. They come because Huaqiangbei can compress months of work into a single afternoon. And the reason any of this works comes down to how Huaqiangbei actually operates. Because beneath the surface, it is nothing like what it seems. There are no factories inside Huaqiangbei. Across its 1.45 square kilometers, what you see are shops, counters, showrooms, and offices. No assembly lines, no warehouses, no smokestacks. At first glance, it looks like a marketplace. It isn't. It's a command center. Here's how it works. A vendor sits behind a tiny counter. He takes orders, shows samples, negotiates prices. Sometimes he even helps shape the product itself. But he doesn't own a factory. What he owns is something far more valuable: relationship. He knows dozens of factories across Shenzhen, Dongguan, and Huizhou, all within roughly a 2-hour drive. He knows who's cheapest this week, who can move fastest, who has the best quality for a specific component. And based on that, he sends the order where it needs to go. So the real model isn't a shop with a factory behind it. It's light asset brokering tied to distributed manufacturing. Huaqiangbei is the brain. It designs, integrates, sources, and takes the orders. The body, the muscle that actually builds things, is spread across the Pearl River Delta. Automated assembly lines, injection molding shops, testing labs, packaging plants, all within a few hours' reach. One counter connected to an entire industrial region. That's the engine. And that's why a single vendor here can take your order in the morning, move it into production by lunch, and have it shipped by the end of the week, without owning a factory at all. But this engine only works because of everything around it. That's what people mean when they talk about supply chain density. It doesn't just mean there are a lot of factories. It means those factories are all within arm's reach of each other, and they've spent decades learning how to work together. Small batches, fast turnaround, minimal inventory, rapid iteration. You design in the morning, sample in the afternoon, adjust overnight, start mass production the next day. That cycle, that rhythm, barely exists anywhere else on Earth. The Financial Times once described Shenzhen as one of the most mature hardware ecosystems on the planet. And the key word there is ecosystem. Because this isn't one great factory, it's thousands of them, operating like a single organism. Each one makes the others faster. But even the fastest production means nothing if you can't move the product out. And then there's the final piece that ties the whole chain together: Yantian Port. It's one of the busiest container ports in the world, and it's right here in Shenzhen. A product can roll off the line and within hours be on a cargo ship heading almost anywhere on Earth. Idea, sourcing, production, global shipping, all inside a single city. In early 2025, Reuters reported major congestion at Yantian. Exporters were rushing to move goods before expected U.S. tariff hikes took effect. And that congestion tells you something important. Even with trade war threats hanging over the system, global supply chains were still racing through this one city. The pipes hadn't moved. The ecosystem hadn't moved. Huaqiangbei for sourcing. The Pearl River Delta for production. Yantian for shipping. Together they create the shortest distance on the planet between "I have an idea" and "it's on a shelf in New York." That is what Shenzhen is really selling. Not cheap labor. A fast, closed-loop industrial system built over decades. And whether you're watching this in Chicago or London, the phone in your pocket has almost certainly passed through that system. You just never saw it. But what kind of force is actually holding that system together behind the scenes? That's what we'll dig into next time. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what part of Shenzhen surprised you the most? And what city should we look at next?